So now hear me out on this. I have this weird theory that I'm not actually here right now and I am stuck somewhere between 2007, 2008, lying in a hospital bed somewhere in a coma. And the evidence just really keeps piling up, and point in case is Afterlife's new EP called Vicious Cycle. And why do I say that? Because it is a rush of nostalgia in a lot of ways. Now, I grew up, as I've mentioned before, in the kind of new metal era of things, with bands like Korn or Edema or Linkin Park being huge, and that style is kind of what brought me into hardcore music and into heavier music in a lot of ways. And I feel like a lot of bands now that are doing hardcore or metalcore really grew up in the same period of time, and it shows. While some bands you can kind of generally hear the influence of them, there's other bands where it's just a full-out new metal revival. We've gotten, for instance, My Ticket Home's last album, Strangers Only, was a fantastic album, but it was so reminiscent of bands like, for instance, Edema. There was a very heavy influence there with that. It felt like a new metal album that had released just within this time period, but it was still more leaning towards what I would call hardcore or metalcore on that album. Now, with this album, Vicious Cycles, it's just full-blown new metal. I mean, this is an album that could have been released 10, 15 years ago, and it would have just been so popular because they did just such a great job with it. I think that it never really stays stuck in its nostalgia. It doesn't feel like it's a ripoff of any of bands of that era. It just feels like it was written while listening to some Spotify playlist of bands like that. But it's got everything that you've expected from new metal. The kind of choppy riffs, the really heavy but almost upbeat drum beats, the rappings and screaming mixture in there, and it's just, I mean, it's all there. I mean, it honestly, like, I can't express enough how much it feels like listening to something written years ago, but in a good way. It feels like a hit of just a wave of nostalgia. It feels like you're sitting down on coming home from school on a Friday evening, got your Sprite remix, and you're playing a copy of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. That's what it kind of feels like, that vibe, that mentality. And for me, it's something I really enjoy because it brings me back to a simpler time. And it's okay to enjoy simpler things. Things don't have to be complex. Things can be enjoyed for just being what they are and taken on face value. I mean, this album kicks off with the song Catalyst, and it's extremely catchy. It's got this pretty awesome hook throughout it, and that's kind of throughout this album. I mean, it's a pretty short EP. It's 15 minutes long, spread over 5 songs. And the thing about that is, though, it never outstays its welcome. I mean, if I'd say anything negative about this album, it's kind of that the vocal work a little bit, especially during the rapping or spoken word, whatever you want to call it, parts, can get a little bit cheesy or kind of uninspired in some ways. It never gets to the point where it's cringeworthy, even with the fairly generic lyrics. It actually ends up being fun overall, but it kind of edges that border really, really close at some points, where I can understand some people kind of seeing it a different way. For me in particular, I absolutely enjoyed it just because I felt like that's kind of what we're looking for when we hear these tracks like this. It's not, there's nothing about it that's progressive or, like I said, complex, but that's not what we're looking for on this album or anything like that. And it works. It's catchy. It's heavy. It's got everything that we could want. And there's just something about the sound that really just has this classic the vibe to it. And even despite its shortness, I mean, that's one of the things I think actually kind of weighs in its favor, because after the fact that it had already been over, I found myself hitting the repeat button more than once just to go back and listen to it again, because I like that vibe, I like that mentality, and I like this album.